Dan was hired by a mysterious contractor to clean an abandoned building, but he never expected to find a room full of snakes when entering one of the rooms. He did not like snakes at all, but something else was at play here. The snakes were very aggressive. Dan had never seen this before. Then he saw something underneath the snakes. He realized they were protecting something. Dan got a strange feeling about this. He was totally baffled. This couldn't be good. But before we start our story, smash the like button, make sure to subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. Dan tried to come closer to the object, but with every step, the snakes became more aware of Dan. Dan had to be careful, but when trying to reach for the object, he was bitten. He felt intense pain in his arm. He could not do this alone. He went back to his van, which was parked right in front of the house. He applied a bandage first, but he still had a lot of pain in his arm. He thought about leaving this alone, but was offered a lot of money to do the job. Then he got a call. Dan was suddenly called by an anonymous number. He picked up. Dan got told that he needed to hurry up, or bad things would happen. Dan looked around. It was like the person was watching him. What was the meaning of this? Dan got threatened by this person. He was told that if he did not deliver the object that same day, bad things would happen to him and his family. Dan was completely shocked. This could not end well for him. Dan mustered all of his courage to call the police, but when they answered, he hung up. He could not risk the safety of his family. It was way too risky. He just needed to clean this room and give this contractor whatever he wanted. He decided he would go back to the room to do what was asked of him. He decided not to call anyone to help him just because he did not know who hired him in the first place. He had to get good protective gear. However, the bite on his arm also started to hurt a lot. This couldn't be good. Dan quickly picked up his gear and drove back to the house. The whole time he had a feeling he was being watched, but he did not see anyone. Dan knew deep down that he needed medical attention, but he decided to get the object out of the room first. Dan reluctantly walked back into the house. He walked up the massive staircase. He already heard the hissing of the snakes. The strange thing was, there were no snakes outside of the room. They were all inside the room. When entering the room again, his jaw dropped. He walked in and gasped. It looked like the room was filled with even more snakes now. They instantly turned to Dan. They were very aware of Dan's presence, but did not straight up attack him. Only when Dan got closer, they reacted. Dan was in total shock. He wondered how he got into this situation in the first place. He should never have accepted the job. He was just hired to clean out the abandoned building. He did not foresee any snakes. He knew he just had to go through with it. This will all be over soon. Dan had worked difficult jobs before but never liked this. There was extra pressure on him. Dan quickly tried to make his way through the snakes. His protective suits seemed to help him a lot, but then he felt something holding him back. It was not a feeling that was holding Dan back, but the snakes started constricting his movement. Sweat broke out, and Dan did not know what to do. He wanted to give up, but he was so close. The snakes started crawling all around his feet, and Dan tripped. This could be the end? Dan felt extremely constricted. The snakes kept circling him. They started biting his suit as well. Dan felt like this could not go well for a long time. He crawled back up and with all his strength moved towards the object. Then he started feeling a lot of pain. He felt pain throughout his entire body. The snakes had managed to penetrate the suit on his right leg. He tried kicking them off, but one managed to bite him. Dan started feeling sick. He then felt something else around his neck. Dan fell to the ground and started gasping for air. He had never felt like this before. It was as if he was strangled by the snakes. Dan kept gasping for air, and he tried throwing the snake off of him at the same time. It had completely circled around Dan's neck. The snake kept putting pressure on me. Dan crawled, and by some miracle, the snake let loose. Dan did not know if it was because he poked it a couple of times in the eyes, or if there was something else. He thought he heard footsteps as well, but it could be the lack of oxygen. However, Dan wasn't wrong. Due to the snake venom and the lack of oxygen, Dan felt extremely unwell. He had managed to drag himself to the hallway, but he realized he had no strength to get up anymore. He did not tell anyone where he was, but he still heard voices. Was this in his head? Dan couldn't take it anymore. He went in and out of consciousness. After a while, he completely blacked out. When he opened his eyes, he wasn't in the hallway anymore. He was downstairs. How did this happen? All around him, he saw people. Dan had no idea what was going on, but then people did not seem friendly at all. He overheard a conversation between two men. They talked about what they should do with Dan. He knows too much. Eventually, Dan gets dragged away. He realizes he is not safe at all. These people do not have good intentions. He was loaded into a white van and they drove him away. Dan tried shouting, but nothing came out of his mouth. He was too scared. Dan still has no idea what is going on. There is a man in a black hoodie next to him. He realizes Dan is awake. He instantly alerts the driver. Another man then got into the back. They did not hesitate. Without asking if he was okay, they started asking questions. Dan recognized one of the voices. It was the man that had called him this morning. The man asked if he had gotten hold of the item in the room. Dan was so weak that he just shook his head. They weren't satisfied with his answer, but then Dan blacked out again. Dan woke up again. He was hooked up to a monitor, and when looking around, he realized he was all alone in a creepy room. Dan had no clue what was going on. When he tried getting up, he realized that he was strapped to the bed. A man that looked like a doctor entered the room. He had stitched up Dan and provided him with the necessary care. The man looked extremely nervous. Dan asked him to let him go, but the doctor remained silent. Then he nodded to a camera. Two men came into the dark room and unstrapped Dan. Dan was dragged into another room. This looked more like an interrogation room. Dan begged the people to let him go, but they wouldn't budge. They started asking him questions. Dan was asked if he knew what they were looking for. He had no idea, but sensed it had to do with the house and the snakes. They needed something valuable from that room without risking themselves. Dan assured them he had told no one about his job, not even his wife. Just as they seemed to believe him, a loud bang echoed. Dan was confused. The man questioning him ran off, and suddenly, gunfire erupted. A flashbang rolled into the room, blinding him. Chaos followed, shouting, loud footsteps. Someone grabbed Dan, telling him to stay low. Moments later, he realized a SWAT team had stormed in. Dan was taken outside. The two men who had interrogated him were arrested. Though relieved, he had questions. The team informed him they weren't there for him, just a stroke of luck. Then he told them about the house and the snakes. His rescuers were skeptical, but Dan had the bite marks to prove it. They followed him to the house only to find his truck burned. Inside, they heard loud hissing. Some officers hesitated, deciding to wait for a specialized unit. Dan, unwilling to enter alone, contacted a police officer he knew. Minutes later, a team in protective suits arrived. The police secured the area. Through a radio, Dan listened as they moved in. Clearing the snakes was tougher than expected. They fiercely guarded something. More backup arrived. The team debated burning the building, but higher-ups wanted to see what was inside. Reinforcements, including Homeland Security, arrived. Dan was told to go home and expect a call the next day. The call came, not from the police captain, but the mayor. Dan was summoned to his office. Uncertain if it was good or bad, he went with his family. The mayor assured him the criminal organization was dismantled and Dan was safe. Then the police captain entered, carrying a medal for Dan's bravery. Finally, they revealed what they found. Clearing the room had taken 5 hours. The mystery unraveled. The snakes had been guarding their eggs, which were extremely rare and valuable. The criminals needed someone unaware of their worth to retrieve them. Dan sighed, relieved it was finally over.